The conclave had not been silent in 400 years, not since the Vork collapse, when 3-star systems went dark in a single cycle and nobody could explain why. Had the grand chamber of the Tethrani Empire fallen into the kind of silence that made senior diplomats check their breathing equipment twice. The silence lingered in your chest, akin to swallowing a stone by mistake. Counselor Sarah Dawn pressed all 4 of her sensory palms flat against the obsidian table. She was Tethrani, tall, fluid in her movements, with a bioluminescent ridge that ran from the crown of her skull down to the base of her spine. That ridge had gone completely dark, although it normally pulsed a calm amber when she was in session. Every diplomat in the chamber noticed. Nobody said anything. The holographic projection above the table showed a single vessel. It was not moving fast by galactic standards. It was not armed in any way the conclave's instruments could recognize. It had no fleet behind it, no escort. There was no signal beacon from any registered civilization in the 12-sector archive. What had made Sarah Dawn's ridge go dark was a resonance signature that the conclave's deepest detection arrays had only ever recorded in one context: grief, not metaphorical grief. It was not the poetic kind of grief that philosophers described in their literature on extinction events. The arrays, made to measure the energy from propulsion systems and weapons cores, were detecting something puzzling to their engineers, a frequency in the ship's drive output that closely resembled, with 99.7% accuracy, the brain activity of a Tethrani elder who was deeply grieving. The ship was broadcasting grief the way a sun broadcasts light, passively, constantly, without apparent intention. Junior Analyst Korov raised one thin hand from his console station at the far end of the chamber. He was only 22 cycles old and had been assigned to the Deep Array Division for 8 months. "Counselor," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the word because he was trying diligently to sound professional. "The vessel has altered course." Sarah Dawn looked at him. "It's coming toward Tethran Prime," he said, not aggressively, not at intercept speed. He paused, checking his readings twice. "It's decelerating, like it wants to be seen, like it wants us to have time to look at it." The stone in Sarah Dawn's chest got heavier. "What is the vessel's classification?" asked High Admiral Vorekton from across the table. He was old and scarred and had commanded 12 campaigns. His ridge pulsed a flat, practiced gray, the color of a soldier who had decided not to feel anything until he had more information. Korov swallowed. "Our archives do not classify it, Admiral. It doesn't match any design in the known registry. The hull material is—" He stopped again. "Analyst," Vorekton said quietly, "complete your sentence." "The hull material is partially organic, sir, but the organic component isn't biological in any way we recognize. It's more like—" The young analyst turned to look directly at the Admiral, which was considered somewhat impolite in Tethrani culture. He did it anyway. "It's more like the ship grew apart itself from memory." The chamber went silent again. On the projection, the vessel drifted closer. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of ship that military architects would call beautiful. It was long and asymmetrical, with sections that looked almost unfinished, as though the builders had started with one vision, and then changed their minds partway through, not from error, but from the evolution of some feeling they were still working out. One side of the hull was smooth and dark as deep water. The other was covered in a surface texture that the scan arrays kept misidentifying as scar tissue. Down in the lower observation deck, a young Tethrani communications officer named Dale Mirren was doing something that was technically outside her assigned duties. She was listening. The ship's systems were not the focus of her attention. She was not referring to the ship's frequency data or propulsion signature. She had rerouted one of the array's passive receivers to the broadest possible setting, and she was simply listening to the sound the ship made as it moved through space. It shouldn't have made any sound. Nothing made a sound in space. That was not a concept. That was physics. But the passive receiver was picking something up, not sound exactly, more like the memory of sound. Her brain persistently attempted to organize the pattern into a familiar form, similar to how your mind constructs shapes from clouds. After 3 minutes of listening, she realized what her brain was trying to tell her. It sounded like someone breathing, not a machine, not a drive cycle. It expanded and contracted with the long, slow rhythm of a creature that had been running for a very long time and had finally decided to stop. She filed a secondary report and went back to her primary console. She did not sleep well that night. By the next cycle, the conclave had pulled every fragment of information it had on the species designated in the most recent Xenological Archive update as classification H7 variant Terran. The file was not small, but it was strange in a specific way that experienced archivists found deeply uncomfortable. It was full of gaps that weren't the result of missing data. They were gaps that looked, on examination, like deliberate choices. It appeared as though the individuals responsible for inputting information into the archive over the centuries had exercised great care in selecting what to include and exclude. What the file contained was this: H7 variant Terran, commonly referred to in informal diplomatic records as humans, were a carbon-based bipedal species originating from a single ocean planet in a quiet arm of the outer middle spiral. Their star was unremarkable. Their planet had a moon large enough to have visibly influenced their evolutionary biology, their early agriculture, their mythology, and their poetry, such as the way lunar cycles shaped their agricultural practices and inspired themes in their literary works. They had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 312 years ago by galactic standard reckoning. In the century since, they had made contact with 7 civilizations. They had joined no formal alliances. They had signed 7 bilateral non-aggression agreements, all of which they had honored precisely. They had intervened in 2 interstellar conflicts, not as combatants, but as what their diplomatic records call witnesses, a term that the Tethrani translator array had flagged with a question mark because it didn't map cleanly onto any Tethrani legal or political concept. They had 1 colony outside their home system. Just one. The colony was called Meridian Station. It was built around a gas giant in a system with no strategic value. According to the archive, it had a population of approximately 9,000. And then, 41 years ago, the archive entry stopped, not tapered off, not faded into incomplete records. Stopped mid-sentence, in the middle of routine quarterly census notation about agricultural yield data on Meridian Station. The sentence read, "Primary crop rotation in the eastern biodome continues to produce above projection yield, with notable improvements in the..." And then nothing. 41 years of nothing. Counselor Sarah Dawn read the incomplete sentence 4 times. She was a diplomat by profession and a historian by instinct, and she recognized, with the cold clarity that comes from too many years of reading between the lines, exactly what kind of nothing this was. This was the nothing that follows catastrophe. She called for a full briefing from the Xenological Division, and the head of that division, a meticulous, slightly anxious scholar named Prensalo, arrived within the hour and delivered news that Sarah Dawn had already half expected. 41 years ago, Meridian Station had been destroyed. Not by war, not by a stellar event. It had been destroyed by a cascade failure in an experimental drive system that 3 human engineers had been testing. A drive built on principles that the Tethrani Empire's own scientists had been exploring at the time and had quietly abandoned as too unstable. 9,000 people. The drive had worked, in the sense that it had achieved the energy output it was designed to achieve. It had failed in the sense that the energy output was not containable, and the station had come apart in a way that the Tethrani's long-range sensors, purely by coincidence, a research array had been pointed in that direction, had recorded in full detail. Prensalo showed Sarah Dawn the sensor recording. She watched it once. She did not watch it again. Was the Empire involved? She asked. Prensalo hesitated. Not directly. That does not directly mean Prensalo. The drive schematics, the theoretical framework the humans were working from, originated in a paper published by the Tethrani Institute for Propulsion Research approximately 60 years ago. It was published openly. Anyone with archive access could have read it. The humans read it. They built on it. He paused. They built further than we intended. Sarah Dawn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And in 41 years, we never contacted them. There was some internal debate about whether an approach would be appropriate, given that we never contacted them," she said again. It wasn't a question anymore. Prensalo pressed his palms together in the Tethrani gesture that meant I have no defense to offer. "Get me the full sensor record of that vessel." Serathon said, "Every detail. I want to know who built it, and I want to know why they came here. Not what we think, what we can actually prove." Prensalo nodded and left. Serathon sat alone in her office and looked at the wall for a while. Her ridge pulsed once, a deep, bruised blue, and then went dark again. Her name was Dr. Lena Marsh, and she had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in approximately 6 years. This was not an exaggeration for effect. Her medical log confirmed it, and she maintained it with the same precise, somewhat compulsive thoroughness that she applied to everything, for hours maximum, usually 3, sometimes 2. She was 47 years old. She had brown hair that had started going silver at the temples around the same time the insomnia started, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in genuine danger often enough that stillness has become their default setting rather than something they have to practice. She was the lead architect of the vessel the Tethrani Conclave was currently panicking about. She had not named the ship. This was deliberate. The 18-person crew who had helped her build the ship had repeatedly asked her to name it, but she had declined each time. A name, she felt, would make the ship into a statement. She didn't want a statement. She wanted a question. The question was this: what do you do with grief when it has no object? This required explanation. When Meridian Station was destroyed, Lena Marsh was 26 years old and living on Earth. She had lost, in the explosion, her mother, her younger brother, and 11 people she had grown up calling family, without any official designation for what they were. She had learned about the disaster through a news notification on her personal device. Between a weather update and a shipping confirmation for a package she had ordered 3 days earlier. The notification said, "Meridian Station, catastrophic failure. All hands lost. Investigation ongoing." The package had contained a set of ceramic mixing bowls she had bought as a birthday present for her mother. The bowls arrived 4 days after the notification. She had left them in the shipping packaging in the corner of her apartment for 3 months before she could look at them. She became an engineer because she needed to understand what had failed. She didn't assign blame because she was too rigorous a thinker to find satisfaction in blame, but rather because she needed to fully understand the shape of the failure. She spent 17 years studying propulsion systems, materials science, and eventually a field that had no proper name yet, but which she privately called grief architecture, the study of how catastrophic events leave structural signatures in the systems around them. The theory she developed, which had taken her another 8 years to prove mathematically, and then another 4 years to actually test, was this: when a massive energy release event occurs in space, the kind that Meridian Station had, it doesn't just release energy, it leaves an imprint. It is neither mystical nor metaphorical. Physical, a pattern pressed into local space-time that persisted far longer than standard models predicted. Like a dent, she had found the dent from Meridian Station. She had mapped it with instruments she had built herself, in a workshop attached to her home, using principles she had developed from the same Tethrani propulsion paper that had, indirectly, contributed to her family's death. She had found that the dent could be used, not as a weapon. It was not intended to serve as a conventional power source. However, it acted like a strong support, a stable spot in local space-time with special features that, if a drive system was made to work with it, let a ship move in ways that weren't exactly faster than light, but got similar travel times through a method that Lena's colleague, Dr. Tom Adler, called falling sideways through the echo of an old wound. Tom was a poet at heart. Lena had found the description annoyingly accurate. The vessel she had built was designed around this principle. Its drive was tuned specifically to the resonance frequency of Meridian Station's death. It moved, at its most fundamental mechanical level, by remembering. This was why the Tethrani rays kept reading grief. They weren't misinterpreting the data. They were correctly identifying something that their theoretical models hadn't yet accounted for. That a sufficiently precise physical system, tuned to the signature of a specific catastrophic event, would broadcast that signature as a byproduct of operation. The ship felt like grief because its engine was built from grief. Lena was sitting in the forward observation bay when the Tethrani hailing signal came through. She had been sitting there for 2 hours, watching the planet grow slowly larger in the viewport. It was beautiful in the way that all inhabited worlds were beautiful from this distance. The light the clouds, and the suggestion of complexity hidden beneath the atmosphere. She let the signal run for a moment before she answered, not from hostility, not from calculation. She simply desired a brief moment of silence before the conversation commenced, a skill she had honed over the course of 47 years. Then she opened the channel. "This is Dr. Lena Marsh," she said. "I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here because I have a question, and I think you're the only ones who can answer it." On the other side of the channel, she heard a sharp intake of breath that she recognized, even across the translation filter, as surprise. Good, she thought. Surprise was better than fear. You could have a real conversation with surprise. The first meeting happened in orbit. Sarah Dawn had proposed a neutral location, a Tethrani diplomatic shuttle, midpoint between the Conclave's orbital station and the human vessel. Lena had agreed without negotiation. Sarah Dawn had noted this. In her experience, the parties most willing to accept proposed meeting locations without counteroffers were either very confident or very tired. She suspected, looking at Lena Marsh across the narrow table of the diplomatic shuttle, that this human was both. The translation system they were using was a standard Tethrani diplomatic array, connected to a human linguistic processor that Lena had brought aboard in a device roughly the size of a fist. It worked better than Sarah Dawn had expected. The Tethrani communication system was technically sophisticated but culturally dense. Their language contained 17 registers that conveyed the speaker's emotional relationship to the information being delivered, and most species found this exhausting to navigate, which made effective communication challenging for those unfamiliar with its nuances. Lena's device handled it without apparent difficulty. "You built the translator yourself?" Sarah Dawn asked. "My team built it. I contributed the base architecture." Lena set the device on the table between them. "I read the Tethrani Institute's published language papers. Your emotional register system is actually not that different from some of the paralinguistic frameworks we use in human communication. You make it explicit. We leave it implicit and fight about it constantly." Sarah Dawn's ridge pulsed briefly, a color that the human probably couldn't read, but which meant something like unexpected amusement. "Why are you here, Dr. Marsh?" she asked. Lena folded her hands on the table. They were steady hands, Sarah Dawn noticed. These were not the hands of someone who was attempting to maintain a state of calm. These were the hands of a person for whom tranquility was merely the present moment. 41 years ago, Meridian Station was destroyed, Lena said. 9,000 people, including my mother, my brother, and 11 others I loved. The drive that failed was built on a framework from a Tethrani propulsion paper, which refers to a theoretical study on advanced propulsion systems developed by Tethrani researchers. Sarah Dawn held very still. "I know. I'm not here about blame," Lena said immediately, and her voice carried a register that even the standard translator rendered with unusual precision, a flatness that meant I have already traveled through blame and come out the other side. "I spent a long time being angry. I know what anger produces. This is something else." "Then what is it?" "The drive that destroyed Meridian Station was trying to do something specific," Lena said. "Something the Tethrani paper suggested was theoretically possible but didn't develop. My family and 8,988 other people died trying to prove the theory." She paused. "I finished the proof." Sarah Dawn said nothing. "The vessel outside," Lena continued, "uses the resonance signature of Meridian Station's destruction as its primary drive anchor. My team calls the mechanism a grief drive, which is not the technical term, but it's accurate." She looked at Sarah Dawn directly. "It works. It outperforms all previous tests we conducted. And the reason it works is specifically because of the Tethrani paper. The failure that killed my family, the theory that produced it, and the proof I have spent 20 years building are all part of the same thread." Sarah Dawn's ridge was cycling through colors rapidly. She couldn't stop it. In Tethrani culture, an uncontrolled rage display in a diplomatic setting was considered deeply unprofessional. She couldn't stop it. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. "Because the proof is incomplete," Lena said. "The drive works, but it's anchored to one specific event. To scale it, to make it something more than one ship built around one specific catastrophe, I need to understand whether the resonance signatures from other events are similarly usable. The event in question took place in Tethrani space. She paused. I need access to your deep archive sensor data. Specifically, I need access to your records of major energy release events over the last 2 centuries. The shuttle was quiet for a moment. You want to build more drives, Serathon said slowly. Anchored to catastrophes. Lena responded. You're anchored to their signatures. The events themselves are over. The physics isn't. The imprint is there whether we use it or not. I'm asking whether we use it. Serathon looked at this human, this quiet, exhausted, devastatingly precise human, and asked a question that had been sitting behind all the others. What do you do? She said carefully. With a technology that only works because something terrible happened? Lena was quiet for a long moment. At last, she said, ensure that the terrible event did not mark the end of the story. Access to the Tethrani Deep Archive was not something the Conclave granted easily. It had been granted 4 times in 400 years, twice to allied civilizations during treaty negotiations. Once, it was granted to a joint scientific commission that was investigating a mutual stellar anomaly. Once, in the most controversial vote in Conclave history, it was granted to a Tethrani cultural critic who argued that the public had a right to know the full scope of the Vorith collapse. The critic had been correct. The Conclave had granted access. The released information reshaped Tethrani civilization's understanding of its own history, a process that continues 4 generations later. The vote on Lena Marsh's request was not unanimous. It was close, closer than Serathon had expected, and she had expected it to be very near. High Admiral Vorektan, who had been quiet during most of the briefings, made the most memorable argument against the opposition in the final session. I have no objection to the technology, he said. I have no objection to humans. What I object to is the precedent. Every major event in that archive has survivors. The Vorith collapse, the searing of the outer stations, the fracture at Deep Point 7, the people who lived through those events, their children, their civilizations. They are still out there. We would be using the resonance of their worst days as raw material to understand the trauma and lessons learned from their experiences to understand the trauma and lessons learned from their experiences without asking them. The chamber was quiet. That's not a reason to refuse, he said. That's a reason to ask. The vote passed with an amendment. The amendment was Vorektan's. Before any Deep Archive event signature was made available, the surviving populations or their descendants would be contacted and asked for their consent. Lena, when Serathon delivered the news, was quiet for a longer moment than usual. That's going to take years, she said. Yes, Serathon said. Okay, Lena said. Serathon had expected negotiation. She had expected frustration. She had not expected it. Okay, you agree? She said. Of course I agree. Vorektan is right. Lena looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people look when they realize they should have thought of something themselves. I've been so inside the physics of this that I didn't think through the I should have thought of the consent question myself. I didn't. He did. So, yes. Okay. However long it takes. She paused, then said something that Serathon would think about for a long time afterward. Can I help with the outreach? She asked. When you contact the survivors, can I be part of those conversations? She did not intend to promote the project. She stopped, then started again. I know what it's like to be on the other side of that kind of loss. I might be useful in those conversations in a way that's not about the drive. Serathon looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said. I think you might be. The archive work began with the records that were already cleared. Tethrani events with no surviving external parties. And what they found there was not what either of them had expected. Lena's theory had predicted that large energy release events would leave usable resonance signatures. What the archive data showed was that the magnitude of the imprint did not correlate with the magnitude of the event. A relatively minor catastrophe, a single station failure from 2 centuries ago, involving 11 lives, had left a resonance signature stronger and more stable than several dramatically larger events. It took Lena 3 weeks to figure out why. The 11 people who had died in the minor event had been, at the time, the entire population of a deep space research outpost. They were a close-knit community, and records showed that all 11 were actively communicating when the failure occurred. The catastrophe had interrupted a conversation. The imprint wasn't just physical. It was, in some measurable and deeply strange way, relational. The event's emotional density, the extent to which the deceased were connected, affected the resonance signature's stability and usability. Lena sat with this finding for a full day before she told anyone. This meant that her drive, her ship, her engine built from grief, functioned, not because of the magnitude of Meridian Station's destruction. It worked because her mother and her brother and 11 people she loved had all been on a call together when it happened. It was a family gathering that was transmitted across the station. They had been laughing. She had never known what they were doing in the moment it happened. Now she did. She sat alone in the small quarters that Tethrani had given her on the orbital station. Holding that knowledge, and for the first time in 6 years, she slept for more than 4 hours. The outreach took 14 months, 17 civilizations. There were 29 distinct surviving populations or cultural successor groups that were identified. Some of them are easy to find, established polities with diplomatic records and official contact protocols. Some of the harder, scattered, communities were living in the aftermath of events so destructive that they no longer had formal governmental structures, just networks of people who remembered, which made it challenging to establish communication and support for their needs, leading to difficulties in addressing their specific requirements and integrating them into broader support systems. Lena attended 31 of the 47 contact meetings. She did not attend these meetings as a technical representative. She did not attend these meetings in the capacity of a human diplomat. As it was never entirely clear what her official role was, Serathon had eventually stopped trying to find it on the formal agenda and just listed her as Dr. Marsh participant. What she did in these meetings was mostly listen. The Tethrani diplomats were skilled and careful, and they were genuinely well-intentioned. But they had a tendency, when explaining the Grief Drive project, to lead with the technical framework and then get to the human meaning of it. And Lena had noticed, in the first 3 meetings, that this order produced a particular kind of resistance, the kind that comes from feeling like your loss has been categorized before you've been heard. She started quietly, asking if she could speak before the technical presentation. She would tell them about Meridian Station. She would share her experiences with her mother and brother, as well as the arrival of ceramic bowls 4 days after the notification. She would discuss the 20 years she had dedicated to not only understanding the shape of the loss, but also striving to undo it, about the discovery that the resonance signatures of catastrophic events were not scars on space-time, but something closer to presence. Not the pain of what was lost, but the fact of what had been there. Some of them said no. 3 civilizations declined entirely. Lena had argued carefully in the conclave debrief sessions that the declinations should be honored without any further contact. She had also argued that the drive should never be used in any system where consent had been declined. Ever. This was true even if the physics had been sound. Vorektan had supported this position. Serathon had supported it. The conclave, after a longer debate than Lena had hoped for, had formalized it as a principle. The 26 civilizations and populations that said yes did so for different reasons. Some said yes because the technology represented progress, and the archive work was respectful. Some said yes because the idea that the resonance of their worst days could be used for movement rather than just recorded as damage felt like an unexpected form of reclamation. Some said yes, and their representatives cried during the meeting, and Lena sat with them without trying to fill the silence, because she had learned that there are moments when the most respectful thing you can do is not move away from someone's grief, but simply remain present inside it. The Orav, a quiet, long-lived species from a binary star system, said yes for a reason Lena hadn't anticipated. Their representative, an elder named Kasserun, said through a device that converted a species' bioluminescent language into audio, "We have been trying to decide what to call what happened to our third moon for 160 years. We have not been able to agree. Some of our people call it a tragedy. Some call it a transition. Some don't call it anything because they don't believe words are adequate." He paused. "If you use its signature in a drive that carries people forward, we will call it the beginning of a longer journey than we understood at the time. That is a name we can agree on." Lena put the sentence in her notes and did not summarize it. She kept it exactly as he had said it. Part 7, what the Admiral knew. It was Vorektan who told her. Throughout the 14 months of outreach, the archive work, and the slowly growing technical collaboration between Lena's team and the Tethrani Propulsion Division, he had been a reliable and somewhat austere presence. He attended meetings. He asked precise questions. He made the amendment about consent that had reshaped the entire project, which included clarifying the ethical considerations and ensuring that all stakeholders were informed and involved in the decision-making process. In all the meetings Lena could recall, he said only what was directly relevant to the business at hand. So when he arrived at her quarters on the orbital station, alone, without diplomatic context or a scheduled meeting, she understood immediately that whatever he had come to say was not the kind of thing he had found a way to say in any official forum. She made tea. This was, she was aware, a gesture that meant something specific to humans, and nothing particular to Tethrani, but he sat with the cup without comment, and she respected him for refraining from familiarity. He mentioned the Tethrani paper. The propulsion framework served as a theoretical foundation for Meridian Station's drive, he stated. Yes, she said. I was involved in the decision to publish it. She was quiet. I was not an admiral then. I was a junior member of the Institute's Strategic Review Board. Our board flagged the paper for review due to its propulsion research with dual-use potential. He looked at the teacup rather than at her. We knew the framework was unstable. Our tests had shown failure conditions that the paper's authors had not fully accounted for, which would lead to significant inaccuracies in their conclusions and potentially misguide future research in the field. We debated whether to require additional caveats. We decided the caveats would make the paper less publishable and that the risk profile was low enough that... Stop, Lena said. He stopped. She sat with it for a moment, a long moment. I'm not going to tell you that's okay, she said. I'm not sure if it's okay, she said. I've thought about the causal chain a lot. Many times. I know where the paper fits in it. She looked at him. I also know that the paper was a foundation for the work I spent 20 years doing that produced the drive. And I know that this conversation, this whole project, the consent framework, the archive work, the aura of calling their moon the beginning of a longer journey, none of this happens without the paper. None of it. That's not absolution, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. I'm not offering absolution. I don't have that to offer. She paused. What I can tell you is that I believe in the difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel. Responsibility is what you do. I don't think you came here to ask me about your guilt. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. I want to be part of the remaining outreach, he said. I want to participate in the conversations we haven't had yet. I want to be in the room. I want to be present in the room, not just as a diplomat representing the conclave. I feel a sense of responsibility for the events that transpired during those times. He stopped. I think I should be there. I think the people we're asking for consent from deserve to know that the Tethrani representative in the room is not just officially responsible. This responsibility is carried personally by someone present in the room. Lena thought about the issue for a while. Okay, she said. He nodded once. He did not say thank you, and she was glad of it. It would have felt wrong. What he gave her instead was something harder and more honest. He stayed and finished the tea, and they sat in the same room with the same weight, and neither of them tried to make it lighter. The technical papers would describe what happened next in precise, measured language that gave no indication of how strange it was to be present for. Over the next 22 months, Lena's team and the Tethrani Propulsion Division used the 26 approved event signatures and new insights from their archive work to create a drive framework that they called multi-anchored, since no technical term fit. Unlike the original grief drive on Lena's vessel, which focused on just one event, the new framework could work with multiple resonance signatures at once, without. Where the original grief drive on Lena's vessel was tuned to a single event, the new framework could operate across a distributed network of resonance signatures. It didn't need to focus on one catastrophe and move forward by remembering it. It could move by remembering many things at once together, not by the magnitude of the individual events, but by the relational quality that Lena had identified, the density of connection. The reality is that they are constantly in active contact with each other. The navigational implications were profound and strange. A ship using the multi-anchor framework didn't travel between points in a straight line. It traveled through what Lena's team began calling the relational web, A network defined not by geometry, but by the pattern connections that had existed, been broken, and left their signatures behind. Tom Adler said it was like navigating through heartbreak. Lena said that was not a technical term. Tom said it was the most accurate description he had. The first full test of the multi-anchor drive was conducted in a Tethrani system, where 3 of the approved signatures existed. The test vessel, built jointly and crewed together with 6 humans and 9 Tethrani, including Korosal, who had asked to be assigned and had been promoted twice. Since the first night, he'd watched the grief-driven vessel drift toward Tethran Prime, completed a transit in 7 hours that would have taken 4 months by conventional drive. The transit log was published in full with all technical specifications. This had been a condition Lena had insisted on from the beginning. Everything discoverable, everything shareable, everything open. She had been asked why. Why not patent it, protect it, and develop it behind a commercial or governmental structure that would give humans leverage in galactic politics? She had answered the same way every time. The signatures we're using belong to everyone who has lost someone, she consistently responded. Not to us. We don't get to own our grief. But the thing that only those who had been on the test transit could fully understand from the log, and that Lena wrote about in a personal document she never published, was what it felt like. It didn't feel like speed. It didn't feel like conventional transit. Instead, it was characterized by a low-level vibration and the visual distortion of watching stars shift. It felt like something she struggled to describe even to herself. It felt like being held by something that survived a terrible ordeal. The ship moved, the drive ran, and the resonant signatures of 26 catastrophes were woven into the navigation, yet none of it felt like damage. It felt like the accumulated evidence showed that things that should have ended, everything continued. She wrote in her personal document, "The drive works because loss is real and connection is real, and the universe keeps records of both." I don't know what that means philosophically. I know what it means mechanically. Maybe that's enough for now. 3 years after Lena Marsh first hailed the Tethrani conclave from her asymmetrical, grief-anchored vessel, she was standing in a shipyard. It was a joint shipyard, the first of its kind built in the Meridian system. The shipyard was situated far from the previous location of the station. The shipyard was situated in a distinct orbit, orbiting the same gas giant around which the station had previously orbited. The choice of location had been deliberate, and it had not been Lena's decision. It had been a collective effort by the families of Meridian Stations 9000, resulting from an 8-month consultation process that produced a document, not a legal agreement or technical specification, but something closer to a letter. The letter said, among other things, "We think it's right that the work continues here. We think they would have wanted to be part of what came next. That's not a guarantee of anything. It's just what we believe about who they were." Lena had read in her quarters on the orbital station and had cried for the first time since the night she learned about the relational resonance. Then she had gone back to work. The shipyard was building 3 vessels, joint crew, joint architecture, joint funding from a consortium that now included 11 civilizations, some of them survivors of the events whose signatures were woven into the drive framework. The Orv had contributed 3 engineers, including a young one who had been born after the event and who was, in Lena's assessment, the most naturally gifted propulsion thinker she had ever met. His name translated, roughly, as carries forward. He said this was a common name in his generation. These names did not reflect the past, but rather the future. Korosal was there, now leading the Tethrani technical integration team. He had grown into his role with the kind of quiet confidence that early responsibility produces in people who take it seriously. He still cracked his voice occasionally when he was excited about something, which Lena found endearing and never commented on. Vorektan had retired from the Admiralty. He was also there. He was not there in any official capacity. He had simply asked if he could join the shipyard team, and the consortium had agreed. So he was working on the material science component of the new hull design with evident and somewhat surprising satisfaction. The hull design was Lena's. It was asymmetrical. She had kept that deliberately, but the 2 sides were no longer divided between smooth and scarred. Both sides were a new material, partially organic and partially synthesized from a compound developed jointly by Lena's team and the Tethrani Institute, and it had a surface quality that was difficult to describe to someone who hadn't seen it. It looked depending on the angle and the light, either like deep water or like something just healed. On the last evening of the third year, Lena stood at the observation window of the shipyard's main bay and looked at the 3 half-built vessels. They were filled with scaffolding, an open framework, and evidence of ongoing work. They were beautiful in an unfinished way. They were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are still becoming what they are. Sarah Dawn came and stood beside her. She had been on the station for a review meeting and had stayed an extra day, which was unusual for her. Lena suspected she had stayed because she wanted to see the ships and hadn't wanted to make that into an official thing. They stood together for a while, without talking. Then Sarah Dawn said, "When the first ship is completed, it will need a name." "I know," Lena said. "Have you thought about one?" "Yes," Lena said. "A few." And Lena was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the observation window, one of the construction crews was working a night shift, and their lights moved slowly across the hull of the nearest vessel in the steady, purposeful pattern of people doing careful work. "I want to name it after the call," she said. "The family gathering on Meridian Station. The one they were all on when it happened." Sarah Dawn waited. "I didn't know for 20 years that they were laughing," Lena said. "I found out from the archive data. They were laughing at something my brother said. I don't know what." She paused. "I used to think being unaware was the worst part. Now I think the not knowing was never really the point. The point was that they were laughing. That was that kind of moment." Sarah Dawn's ridge pulsed. The deep amber of someone present with someone else's grief, not managing it, just being inside it alongside them. "What was the call's designation in the station records?" she asked. "Family Channel 7, Lena said, which was just a default label for the personal communication band, not a real name. "Then give it one," Sarah Dawn said. Lena looked at the ships. "The laughter you didn't hear," she said. "That's what I want to call the first one." The name was not included in any official document that night. It was just spoken once, in an observation bay, between 2 people who come a long way together by a route neither of them had planned. But in the morning, Lena filed the paperwork. And 3 months later, when the first ship's hull was sealed and its drive was installed, and its crew of 23, human and Tethrani and Orav, and 3 others from civilizations that had not existed in each other's awareness until a grief-anchored vessel had drifted toward a panicking empire and asked a question, stood in a launch bay and waited for signal. The name was on a hull in 4 languages. The laughter you didn't hear. It launched on a Tuesday, an unremarkable day that was exactly right. It moved through the relational web, through the echoes of lost connections, through the resonance of interrupted conversations and broken continuities, and all the terrible specific evidence that things had existed and mattered. It carried 23 people forward into a galaxy that was, in some small but not insignificant way, less afraid of its own history than it had been before quiet. Exhausted woman had arrived in an asymmetrical ship and asked what you do with grief when it is no. Object. You give it one. You give it a direction. You move. Yendi.